In this video, we're going to talk to Dr. Susan Park, International Relations Scholar, about her work with Multilateral Development Banks.
My name is Susan Park. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. I attended the Earth Systems Governance Conference in Utrecht for the Earth Systems Governance Annual Conference, and this is where about 400 social scientists come together to talk about the trends in environmental governance and what we see happening in the world and what needs to be done in order for us to be able to transition into a sustainable environment, a sustainable, livable world. So I got to present my work there as part of a semi-plenary in a church to my peers, where I could outline my research on accountability and global environmental governance, which is work I do with Teresa Kramatz from the University of Toronto. And in presenting our research, we were able to show or present a theoretical framework for understanding environmental governance and why perhaps accountability may not be a meaningful tool for action. We tend to consider accountability, which is a buzzword in everywhere, as a means to provide a much more to solve problems at the international level. And we look as to why that might not be the case. While we create measurement, compliance, monitoring efforts, which we seek to hold actors governing the global environment to account, but in actual fact, they're designed by the people that are being held to account. And that creates certain problems because there are implicit biases that are therefore built into any form of accountability. So in terms of my recent publications, I've got a book out with Cambridge University Press called International Organizations and Global Problems, Theories and Explanations. And this is primarily a theoretical analysis or a way to think through how we use theory to understand change in international organizations. Multilateralism is one of the primary means through which governments choose to try and address problems at the international level. And there's been a significant threat to multilateralism through delays in the climate change agreement, challenges by the Trump administration to the International Criminal Court, to the World Trade Organization. So multilateralism is generally being considered under threat at this point, but at the same time, it's awfully resilient in terms of we need some means between states to cooperate, and we have those in place. So the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. So the book actually tries to think through how we can analyze what are the main impediments to that multilateral cooperation and whether or not there are different theories through thinking through how these organizations as bureaucracies can respond to the charged political environment. The future for multilateralism is that it's much more difficult to get agreement at the international level. And I think this is a basic realignment reflecting the changing balance of power. So we have rising states like China, like Brazil, who want to see greater equity in the international system and reflecting their international standing. At the same time, we have developed countries who do not necessarily recognize the role that they've played in creating that international system. So we have the United Kingdom pushing towards Brexit, trying to leave the EU, and in many cases doing themselves a lot of harm. We've got the United States trying to walk away from a range of institutions that it created after the Second World War. So we're seeing a sort of reformulation or a rethinking of how multilateralism can help states given their own understandings of the international system. So I'm working on two projects. I'm working on a project on the accountability of the Multilateral Development Banks, and a second major strand of work is looking at the renewables footprint. So this is a really new project with Teresa Kramatz from the University of Toronto and Craig Johnson from Guelph University, both in Canada. And the renewables footprint seeks to identify how in the current age, where we're trying to move to renewables in order to meet our climate change commitments, to identify what impact environmentally and socially that transition will have. So even though renewables is overwhelmingly a positive thing in terms of weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, they're still dependent on minerals and vital resources that are extractive intensive. And this can have dramatic impacts throughout the supply chain from the extractive point to the consumption point. So one of my major strands of research has been on the accountability mechanisms of the multilateral development banks, and this is primarily where people that have been adversely affected by an international development project, whether or not they've been pushed off their land without compensation or had access to grazing lands taken away from them as a result of that development project, they can go to these grievance mechanisms for recourse. So my research has been to identify why the recourse mechanisms were created, why they keep being restructured, and whether or not they've improved in terms of being responsive to communities. So I find that there are 3 takeaways from my accountability mechanism project on the multilateral development banks. The first is that powerful states like the US use 2 different strategies in order to achieve change within the banks and international organizations more broadly. So informally, they try and use their ability to influence other shareholders, but also internally within the organizations to achieve change. So persuasion and trying to change the minds of bank management, but also other member states. Formally, they use their vote in order to vote for change that they've informally tried to push forward. And the third means through which the United States has tried to achieve change is by using its power of the purse, which is to effectively either threaten to withhold financing or to use financing as an incentive to bring about change. 2 other takeaways come out from my research is that the banks have been highly resistant to change, which means that they've tried to minimise the impact that grievance mechanisms or accountability mechanisms have within their organisation, which means that a lot of the grievance mechanisms have been created as highly technical institutions that can be quite difficult for project affected people who don't speak English, might not have access to the internet, and are unfamiliar with the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks' environmental and social safeguard policies. So all of these things make it very, very difficult for people to be able to make claims and have their voices heard, and therefore receive some form of recourse for being negatively affected by the bank's financing. The third takeaway is that the accountability mechanisms have improved, and they've improved over a 25-year period. So they've become much more responsive to project affected people, telling them what's happening in the process, enabling them to comment during the process. They've also become much more transparent, and this is still even a very recent phenomena. So all of the multilateral development banks now have publicly available case registries, so you can identify which projects have had claims made about them and for what has happened. They've improved in terms of being able to provide recourse to be responsive to project affected people. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they always work, but there are definite trends in a positive direction. I just published a database on the claims submitted to the Multilateral Development Banks accountability mechanisms. So this looks at basically 25 years of claims by people that have been adversely affected in terms of socially and environmentally by international development projects. And what the database does is it's fully searchable and fully usable for students and other researchers to identify how many people are making claims, what claims, which projects they're making claims about, whether or not which environmental and social policies have been triggered as a result of those claims. Is it a failure in environmental assessment? Is it a failure of biodiversity policy? Is it a failure of international waterways? And then, so you can search the database across a range of ways, whether or not it was financed by the World Bank, by the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. And this provides a sort of functioning tool for scholars and researchers and the general public to identify, what people are seeking recourse for, but also what happened, whether or not they went to mediation, whether or not that mediation was successful, leading to a resolution of the problem, whether or not it went to compliance investigation and the bank was found to be non-compliant with its own environmental and social policies, and whether or not that led to monitoring in terms of forcing the banks to become compliant with their own policies and hopefully improving the problem. All of the information about my projects on accountability, on environmental footprints can be found on my website, and that provides all information as well as my freely accessible database on claims to multilateral development banks. And you can find my website linked in the description. I hope that was useful. Thanks for listening.